Mia Jackson, a young black woman in her mid-20s, was no stranger to confrontation, but she wasn't looking for any tonight. She'd come to a small town where her father, Tom Jackson, a retired Special Forces operative, had grown up. It was the kind of town that barely changed with the years, a place that clung to its traditions and its people, rarely welcoming newcomers, and certainly not outsiders like her. Tom had left this place a long time ago, seeking a life beyond its narrow streets and even narrower minds. Yet his reputation here remained solid, even looming. He was known as a man of honor and unbreakable resolve, a man who didn't just take care of business, he defined it. But Mia hadn't come to delve into her father's past. She simply wanted to unwind a bit, maybe have a drink, and enjoy a quiet evening away from the city's demands. The sun had just set, casting long shadows over the small town. The bar she chose looked innocuous enough from the outside. Its old wooden sign creaked slightly as it swayed in the evening breeze, and the warm glow from the inside looked inviting. But as soon as Mia stepped through the door, she could feel the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The laughter and chatter quieted momentarily, and several pairs of eyes turned to look at her. She could almost feel their judgment, a silent question lingering in the air. What is she doing here? Mia kept her gaze steady, unfazed by the uncomfortable stares. This wasn't the first time she'd felt like an outsider, and she knew how to handle herself. Dressed simply yet confidently, she exuded a calm dignity, moving toward an empty seat at the bar with her head held high. She wasn't about to let a few suspicious glances ruin her evening. Besides, she'd been raised by Tom Jackson, a man who had instilled in her the importance of strength and resilience. If anyone could handle herself here, it was Mia. Behind the bar stood Rick, a burly, unshaven man in his late 40s, with a permanent scowl etched onto his face. Rick was a fixture in this town, a man who ran his bar with a heavy hand and a sharp tongue. He'd worked here for over 2 decades, and he took pride in knowing nearly every face that came through the door. This was his territory, a place where he set the rules and expected everyone to fall in line. And Rick didn't like surprises, especially not the kind that walked in uninvited and challenged the familiar rhythm of his bar. As Mia took her seat and waited patiently for service, Rick deliberately ignored her. He busied himself, serving a few regulars, chatting and laughing with them, all the while casting sidelong glances at her. She noticed, of course, but chose to keep her focus on the menu in front of her, pretending not to care. She'd learned long ago not to give people like him the satisfaction of a reaction. But the tension in the room grew palpable, each second that ticked by deepening the divide between her and the locals around her. She could feel the weight of their suspicion pressing down on her, like a hot, prickling sensation on her skin. After what felt like an eternity, Rick finally sauntered over, leaning heavily on the bar in front of her. His face twisted in a mock smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. His voice was loud enough that a few heads turned, and a couple of regulars nearby leaned in, watching with keen interest. "Yes," Mia replied, keeping her tone polite but firm. "I'll have a beer, please." She met his gaze without flinching, showing him that she wasn't intimidated by his attitude. She'd dealt with worse. Rick snorted, straightening up and folding his arms across his chest. "You sure you're in the right place?" His eyes scanned her up and down, barely masking the disdain on his face. The message was clear: you don't belong here. Mia raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I think I can handle it." That simple response seemed to irritate him even more. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "Listen, we don't usually get people like you around here. It's a nice, quiet town, and we'd like to keep it that way." Mia's smile faded. She kept her expression calm, but her eyes narrowed slightly. I just came for a drink, that's all. Rick stared at her for a moment longer, then laughed an ugly, mocking sound. He turned and grabbed a beer, placing it roughly in front of her, the foam spilling slightly over the rim as if to emphasize his disdain. Fine, he muttered. Just don't cause any trouble.
Mia ignored his tone, lifting her glass with steady hands. She took a small sip, feeling the burn of indignation rise in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the bar patrons on her, the silent judgment and disdain, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't her fight, at least, not yet.
The patrons resumed their conversations, though the atmosphere in the bar remained tense. Some of the men exchanged murmurs, glancing over at her occasionally. Mia could hear fragments of their conversation, the casual way they made assumptions about her. Words like troublemaker and outsider floated through the air, barely whispered but loud enough for her to catch. Each word was like a small cut. But Mia reminded herself that she didn't owe them anything, not her respect, not her fear, and certainly not her dignity. Meanwhile, Rick continued to serve the others, casting her occasional, hostile glances. He clearly didn't appreciate her presence and made no attempt to hide it. After a while, he wandered over again, emboldened by the approving nods and chuckles from some of his regulars. This time, he wasn't even trying to mask his contempt. "So, you just passing through?" he asked, his voice laced with mock curiosity. Mia looked up, her expression unreadable. "Something like that." "Well, just a friendly word of advice," Rick continued, leaning closer. "People here don't like strangers coming in and stirring things up. Makes him uneasy." Mia's patience was wearing thin. She set her glass down with a controlled calmness that masked her rising irritation. "I'm not here to stir anything up. Just here for a quiet drink like everyone else." Rick's eyes narrowed, his face hardening. "Yeah, well, sometimes it's better to drink with your own kind. You know what I mean?" The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Mia could feel her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression impassive. She'd heard things like this before, but it never made it any easier. A few patrons murmured in agreement, nodding along as if Rick had said something wise and insightful. She locked eyes with him, her voice steady. "Maybe it's time you stopped worrying about what kind of people belong here and start worrying about how you treat them." The defiance in her tone didn't sit well with Rick. His face flushed with anger, and he took a step back, sneering. Big talk for someone who doesn't know her place. With that, he picked up the beer bottle and, without warning, shoved it towards her face, the cold glass pressing uncomfortably close to her lips. Mia jerked back in shock, her hand instinctively coming up to push him away. But the gesture didn't go unnoticed. Several patrons gasped, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with barely concealed anticipation. Rick smirked, clearly pleased with himself. "Drink up, sweetheart," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "That's what you came here for, right?" Mia's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fury and humiliation washing over her. But she knew better than to rise to his bait. Taking a slow, steadying breath, she pushed his hand away with a calmness that belied the fire in her eyes. "Don't touch me," she said quietly, but firmly. The quiet power in her voice caught Rick off guard. He glared at her, but for a moment he hesitated, sensing the strength beneath her composed exterior. The bar was silent again, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. But Mia didn't look away. She held his gaze, unflinching, as if daring him to push her further. The tension in the bar was electric. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. The patrons watched in silence, some barely masking their amusement. while others showed faint traces of discomfort. Rick's eyes burned with resentment, his expression hardening into a sneer as he stared Mia down, trying to provoke her into a reaction. Mia kept her posture calm and her expression neutral, but she could feel her pulse pounding. Every instinct told her to stand her ground, to push back against this man who clearly took pleasure in intimidating her. Yet, she knew that any reaction could quickly spiral into something dangerous. This was his turf, and he held the advantage. Rick leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper, loud enough for only her and a few nearby patrons to hear. "You don't belong here, girl. People like you don't understand how things work around here. You're out of your depth, thinking you can just walk in and act like you own the place." Mia's eyes narrowed, but she remained silent, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. This only seemed to fuel his anger further. He wanted her to react, to lash out, to give him a reason to escalate the situation. His gaze held a dangerous glint, one that promised trouble if she continued to defy him. "You're just going to sit there like a scared little mouse," he taunted, his lips curling into a sneer. "I bet you're used to having people back down, aren't you? Thinking your attitude's enough to scare anyone off. But not here. Not with me." His hand gripped the edge of the bar, his knuckles white with tension, as if he were fighting the urge to reach out and grab her. Mia met his gaze, her voice steady but low. "I came here for a drink, not to be harassed. So if you don't mind, I'd like to be left alone." Her words were calm, almost too calm, and that calmness was like a slap in the face to Rick. He expected fear, submission, maybe even an apology. Instead, she was holding her ground, unshaken by his aggression. It was a silent challenge, and he felt it in his gut. He couldn't let her win this standoff in front of his regulars, couldn't let this stranger come into his space and disrespect him. "Maybe you didn't hear me," he snarled, his tone dropping further, seething with suppressed rage. "This isn't a place for people like you. We keep things simple here, and we don't need anyone coming in and acting like they own the damn place. So why don't you take your little attitude and get the hell out?" Mia's patience was wearing thin. She'd dealt with people like Rick before, men who used their size, their power, or their position to bully others, men who couldn't stand the idea of someone challenging them. She could feel the fire rising within her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Tom had taught her the importance of keeping her composure, of not letting people like Rick see her flinch. But tonight, that lesson felt like a weight pressing down on her, a constant reminder of just how much she had to hold back. "I don't see any rules saying I can't be here," she replied, her tone cool and unyielding. "So maybe you should worry less about me and more about doing your job." Her words cut through the air, sharp and defiant. She didn't raise her voice, but the strength in her tone was unmistakable. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably, sensing that things were about to take a dark turn. Rick's face twisted, a flush of red creeping up his neck as her words hit him harder than he'd expected. He took a step back, only to lunge forward again, gripping the beer bottle he'd shoved at her earlier. He held it in his hand like a weapon, his knuckles turning white as he tightened his grip. His voice was barely more than a growl. "You think you can come in here and talk to me like that?" Mia didn't flinch. She simply looked him in the eyes, her expression unwavering. "I think you should put that bottle down." For a moment they stared each other down, locked in a silent battle of wills. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, and everyone around them could feel it. The regulars watched with a mix of fascination and apprehension, waiting to see if Rick would actually go through with whatever he was planning. A few of them murmured among themselves, some chuckling under their breath, while others exchanged worried glances. But none of them stepped forward to intervene. Rick's voice dropped, dripping with venom. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But I'll make this real simple for you. You don't leave and there's going to be trouble. Mia's patience finally snapped. She stood up slowly, her face just inches from his, her voice low and unyielding. Go ahead. Show everyone here what kind of man you really are. It was a direct challenge, one that left him with no way out. He'd backed her into a corner, thinking she'd cower, but now he was the one being pushed to act. He'd forced her to this point, and he couldn't back down without losing face in front of his regulars. He wanted to show her that he was in control, that he owned this place and everyone in it. With a sudden, violent motion, Rick swung the beer bottle, narrowly missing Mia's face as she jerked back just in time. The bottle slammed against the edge of the bar, shattering on impact. Shards of glass flew across the counter, and a few patrons recoiled, startled by the unexpected escalation. A murmur spread through the bar, a mixture of shock and excitement. The regulars leaned in, captivated by the unfolding drama, while others looked away, uncomfortable with how far things had gone. Mia steadied herself, her pulse racing. She hadn't expected him to actually take it this far, but she wasn't about to back down now. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her, sharpening her senses, heightening every sound, every movement around her. The murmurs grew louder, and she could feel the weight of every gaze in the room bearing down on her, watching, waiting to see what she would do next. Rick sneered, breathing heavily, his face flushed with a twisted sense of triumph. He thought he'd finally broken her, forced her to realize who held the power here. You're just like the rest, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Think you're better than everyone else. Think you can come in here and get your way. Mia clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted nothing more than to put this man in his place, to strip away the smugness on his face, but she knew better. A confrontation here, on his turf, would only make things worse. She took a steadying breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Without a word, she reached for her phone, pulling it out slowly. Rick's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. Oh, what? You're gonna call someone? You think anyone's gonna care? His voice was laced with mockery, but Mia ignored him, pressing a single button on her phone and holding it to her ear. Dad, she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a simmering anger. I need you to come down here. Now. The bar went silent, the words hanging in the air like a warning. Rick's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He didn't know who Mia's father was, but the calm authority in her voice gave him pause. For the first time, he sensed that he might have underestimated her, that there was more to this girl than he'd assumed. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He straightened up, his face hardening as he tried to regain control. I don't care who you call, he snapped. This is my bar, and I decide who stays and who goes. Mia locked eyes with him, her expression unyielding. We'll see about that. The words were soft, but they carried a weight that even Rick couldn't ignore. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at his regulars for reassurance, but the usual support wasn't there. Some of them were now eyeing Mia warily, as if sensing the shift in power. There was something in her demeanor, something quietly defiant, that made them hesitate. Mia stayed where she was, her heart pounding but her resolve unwavering. She'd called in her last line of defense, and she knew her father wouldn't take this lightly. The silence in the bar grew thick as a storm cloud, stretching the moments between Mia's call and her father's arrival into an eternity. Every pair of eyes in the room flickered between her and Rick, who stood by the bar, his posture tense and defiant, like an animal preparing to defend its territory. Mia could sense the unease seeping into the atmosphere, a potent cocktail of aggression and anticipation. She remained where she was, standing tall, her phone still gripped in her hand, her gaze unwavering. Rick glared at her, his face twisted with anger and disdain. "So you think your daddy's going to come here and save you, huh?" His voice dripped with condescension, but Mia saw the faintest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was trying to keep up his facade, to maintain control of the room and remind everyone who was in charge, but it was clear that her call had rattled him. Mia didn't respond, holding his gaze with a calmness that only seemed to stoke his fury. She knew she didn't need to say anything. Her silence was an answer in itself. Her confidence wasn't the bravado of someone picking a fight, rather. It was the quiet resolve of someone who knew help was on the way and was fully prepared to stand her ground until it arrived. Rick slammed his fist onto the bar, the sound echoing through the room. A few patrons flinched, casting wary glances at each other. "You think you're better than us?" he sneered. "Walking in here with your head held high, looking down on everyone like you own the damn place." Still, Mia refused to take the bait. Her calmness only fueled his anger, and Rick's patience was wearing thin. He could feel his regulars watching him, waiting to see how he would handle this. They weren't used to seeing him challenged, especially not by someone who had no ties to the town and no allegiance to its unwritten rules. Finally, one of the patrons, a wiry man named Hank who was rarely sober and never missed a chance to stir up trouble, stood up and approached Rick with a smirk. "Come on, Rick," he slurred, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We all know she doesn't belong here. Why don't you show her how we handle outsiders?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the bar. The regulars nodded, emboldened by Hank's words, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Mia felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach as she realized the situation was about to take a darker turn. Rick's sneer returned, his confidence bolstered by the support of his friends. He took a step closer to her, his posture aggressive, his eyes burning with contempt. "You heard him," Rick snarled, his voice low and menacing. "People like you come in here thinking you can do whatever you want. But this is my bar, and I don't take kindly to people who don't respect the rules." Mia held her ground, her expression unwavering. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, heightening her senses, sharpening her focus. But she didn't let her fear show. She wouldn't give Rick or his cronies the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "I haven't broken any rules," she replied calmly. "I came here for a drink, just like everyone else. The only one causing a scene is you." The room went silent, her words landing like a slap. Rick's face twisted with rage, and he clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. For a moment, Mia thought he might lash out, but he seemed to catch himself, his lips curling into a cold, humorless smile instead. "Oh, you've got a mouth on you, don't you?" he sneered, leaning in so close that she could smell the sour stench of beer on his breath. "Well, let's see if you're still so brave when your daddy gets here. I'll teach you both a lesson you won't forget." Mia's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue. She knew Rick was trying to provoke her, to push her into saying or doing something that would give him an excuse to escalate the situation further. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She stayed silent, her gaze locked on his, a quiet defiance that only seemed to deepen his fury. Several long, tense minutes passed. The silence in the bar was oppressive, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Then, finally, the door swung open and Tom Jackson stepped inside. He didn't make a grand entrance, he simply walked in, his tall, solid frame filling the doorway, his face calm and impassive. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, his eyes landing on Mia, then moving to Rick with a cold, appraising look. The regulars, who had been so eager for a confrontation just moments before, suddenly went quiet. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding Tom's gaze. Even Hank, who had been so vocal earlier, looked down at his drink, his bravado evaporating under the weight of Tom's silent scrutiny. Rick, however, was undeterred. He straightened up, meeting Tom's gaze with a sneer. "So you're the daddy, huh?" he drawled, his tone mocking. "Well, I don't care who you are. In my bar, I make the rules. And your little girl here thought she could just waltz in and disrespect me. Now she's going to learn that actions have consequences." Tom didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at Rick, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and steady. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, and unshakable, a voice that commanded attention without needing to raise itself. "Is that so?" Tom's tone was even, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it, a quiet authority that made Rick's smirk falter. "You think this is about respect?" Rick scoffed, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held just moments before. "Yeah, that's right. You think just because you walked in here, I'm supposed to bend over backward? This is my bar, my territory. And I don't let anyone, especially people like you, come in here and act like they own the place." Tom took a step closer, his gaze fixed on Rick with a focus so intense that even the most hardened of the regulars felt a chill run down their spines. His movements were measured, controlled, like a predator sizing up his prey. "People like me," he repeated softly, his tone deceptively mild. Rick opened his mouth, ready to retort, but the words seemed to die in his throat as he found himself trapped in Tom's unyielding stare. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that twisted in his gut and made him question his position. But he couldn't back down, not in front of his regulars, not after he'd made such a spectacle. "Yeah, people like you," he snapped, his voice tinged with a desperation he couldn't fully hide. "You don't get to walk in here and make demands. This is my space. And if you think you're going to come in here and intimidate me, you've got another thing coming." Tom's gaze didn't waver. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them until he was mere inches away from Rick. His voice dropped to a whisper, low enough that only Rick could hear. "I don't need to intimidate you," he said softly, his tone colder than ice. "You've already done that to yourself." The words hit Rick like a punch, and he instinctively took a step back, his face paling. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Tom's presence was like a force of nature, silent and unyielding, a reminder of the strength and resolve that had been forged through years of hardship and sacrifice. For a moment, Rick was acutely aware of the difference between them, of the fact that, despite his bluster and bravado, he was utterly outmatched. But his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. He straightened up, forcing himself to meet Tom's gaze, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You think you're so tough," he spat, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You think you can just walk in here and scare me? Well, I've dealt with worse than you, old man." Tom's expression didn't change. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, a silent challenge hanging in the air between them. The room was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. The regulars watched with bated breath, their anticipation mounting as the tension escalated. Then, in a sudden, explosive movement, Rick lunged forward, his fist swinging toward Tom's face. But Tom was ready. With a speed that belied his age, he sidestepped the blow, his movements fluid and practiced. Before Rick could react, Tom's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist in a vise-like grip. The room collectively gasped as Tom twisted Rick's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees with an effortless strength that spoke of years of training and discipline. Rick grunted in pain, his face contorted with humiliation and rage. He struggled against Tom's grip, but it was no use. Tom's hold was unbreakable, his strength overwhelming. The regulars sat frozen, too stunned to intervene, their eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. Tom leaned in, his voice low and deadly. "You've had your fun, Rick," he murmured, his tone as cold as steel. "But it ends here. You don't get to bully people just because you're insecure and desperate for control. I don't know what you think you've achieved tonight, but all I see is a coward." The words hit Rick harder than any physical blow, and he sagged in Tom's grip, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Tom's quiet, unyielding authority. He looked up, meeting Tom's gaze with a mixture of anger and shame, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Let me go." Tom held him there for a moment longer, letting the silence stretch, his grip unyielding. Then, finally, he released him, stepping back with a look of calm disdain. Rick scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm, his face flushed with humiliation. He cast a furious glance around the room, his gaze lingering on his regulars, who now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. Without another word, Tom turned to Mia, his expression softening as he extended his hand. She took it, rising to her feet, her gaze lingering on Rick with a quiet satisfaction. They walked out of the bar together, leaving behind a stunned silence, the weight of Tom's words hanging heavy in the air. As Tom and Mia left the bar, a cold silence filled the room. The remaining patrons were still processing what they had witnessed, casting uneasy glances at Rick, who stood hunched by the bar, clutching his arm where Tom had twisted it. The pride and arrogance that had defined him just minutes ago were gone, replaced by a bitter humiliation that seeped into every corner of the room. He felt the eyes of his regulars on him, each look a painful reminder of his own failure and the powerlessness he had just displayed. This wasn't how things were supposed to go, not in his bar. Outside, the night was quiet, with only the soft hum of streetlights breaking the stillness. Tom walked beside Mia, his presence radiating a silent strength. Mia could feel the tension melting away, the adrenaline that had sustained her in the bar now replaced by a deep sense of relief. She had seen her father's controlled fury, the way he had effortlessly neutralized Rick, and it reminded her just how fiercely he would defend her. She felt both gratitude and awe. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom turned to her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Mia. No one treats you like that. Not while I'm around." His voice was steady, filled with a protective resolve that comforted her. Mia gave him a small smile, nodding as they continued down the street. But her mind was racing, replaying the confrontation in the bar. Despite the satisfaction of seeing Rick humbled, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There was something in Rick's eyes, a simmering hatred that hadn't been extinguished, only momentarily suppressed. She knew that people like him didn't take humiliation lightly, and she was right. Back in the bar, Rick's anger began to bubble to the surface, rising with each passing second. His face twisted with rage, and his hands shook as he looked around the room, meeting the stares of his regulars. He could see their pity, their disappointment, and worst of all, the smirks of those who secretly enjoyed seeing him put in his place. That last look from Hank, his supposed friend, was the final straw. Rick slammed his fist down on the bar, the sound reverberating through the room. "You think that was funny?" He spat, his voice a low, venomous growl. "You think I'm just gonna let that old man walk in here, humiliate me, and get away with it?" Hank shifted uncomfortably, shrugging. "Well, Rick, it kind of looked like he had you beat. I mean, we didn't see you doing much to stop him." The words were barely out of his mouth before Rick lunged at him, grabbing Hank by the collar and pulling him close, his face contorted with fury. "You think I'm weak?" he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You think I'm just gonna sit back and let people walk all over me?" Hank tried to pull away, but Rick's grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. The other patrons watched, some with expressions of discomfort, others with quiet satisfaction. They'd seen Rick bully people before, seen him wield his authority over the bar like a weapon. But tonight the tables had turned, and the regulars were starting to realize that Rick's power wasn't as absolute as he wanted them to believe. With a snarl, Rick released Hank, shoving him back into his seat. He took a step back, breathing heavily, his mind racing. He couldn't let this go. Tom and Mia had embarrassed him, undermined his authority, and made him look weak in front of the entire bar. He knew that if he didn't do something, his reputation would be tarnished forever. As he stood there, stewing in his own resentment, a dark thought took hold in his mind, a plan that would show everyone in this town that he was not someone to be crossed. He wouldn't just confront Tom and Mia again, he would make them pay. And this time he would make sure they understood who held the real power. Rick glanced around the bar, his gaze settling on a few of his more loyal patrons, men who had known him for years and who, despite their misgivings, still respected his authority. He nodded to them, a silent signal that only they would understand. They exchanged glances, some nodding back, others looking away, reluctant but unwilling to defy him. As the minutes passed, Rick's plan began to solidify. He would follow Tom and Mia, wait until they were isolated, and confront them on his own terms. This time there would be no bystanders, no witnesses to watch him fall short. He would have the upper hand, and he would make sure they understood just how badly they had misjudged him. Meanwhile, Tom and Mia continued walking down the quiet street, their footsteps echoing softly in the cool night air. Tom had his arm around Mia's shoulder, a reassuring presence that kept her grounded. They walked in comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts, until Mia finally spoke. "Dad, do you think he'll try something else?" she asked, glancing up at him with a worried expression. Tom's face hardened, and he paused, looking down the empty street before answering. "People like him don't take humiliation well. I'd be surprised if he just let this go." Mia bit her lip, her mind racing. "So what do we do?" Tom placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We stay vigilant. Don't worry, Mia. I'm not going anywhere." They continued walking, but Tom's senses were on high alert. Years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him that trouble was near. He didn't let on to Mia, but he was acutely aware of the possibility that Rick could try to ambush them. He knew the type men like Rick didn't accept defeat easily. They clung to their pride, even if it meant losing everything. As they rounded a corner, Tom caught a faint sound behind them, the quiet scuff of footsteps trying to stay hidden. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable, but his mind racing. In the dim light of the street lamps, he saw a group of shadows moving behind them, trying to stay out of sight. It didn't take long to recognize Rick's broad frame leading the group, his face barely visible but unmistakable. Tom's jaw tightened, and he slowed his pace slightly, placing himself between Mia and the approaching figures. "Mia," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Stay close. We're not alone." Mia glanced back, her eyes widening as she spotted Rick and his men trailing behind them. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively moved closer to her father, her trust in him unwavering. Tom could feel her tension, but he kept his own movements calm, controlled. If this was going to turn into a confrontation, he would be ready. Rick's voice broke the silence, loud and mocking. "Hey, old man, you think you can just walk away after what you did?" His tone was laced with malice, each word a challenge meant to provoke. Tom stopped in his tracks, turning slowly to face Rick and his men. He looked at each of them, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Is that what you want, Rick?" Another lesson. His voice was calm, almost casual, but there was a steely edge to it that sent a shiver down Mia's spine. Rick sneered, stepping forward. His arm was still sore from where Tom had twisted it, and the pain only fueled his anger. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he spat. "You think you're so tough. Just because you got the drop on me back there? Well, let's see how tough you are now." Tom didn't respond. He simply stood his ground, his posture relaxed but ready, his eyes never leaving Rick's. The other men shifted uncomfortably, clearly hesitant. They had expected Rick to confront Tom in the safety of the bar, where they held the advantage. Out here in the empty street, with no walls or bystanders to trap Tom and Mia, the situation felt different, more dangerous. But Rick was too far gone, too consumed by his own wounded pride to back down. He took another step forward, emboldened by the presence of his men. "I'm not afraid of you," he sneered. "You're just an old man clinging to his glory days. You think you're something special, but you're nothing." Tom's gaze didn't waver. He could see the desperation in Rick's eyes, the need to prove himself, to reclaim the power he felt had been stolen from him. He knew men like Rick all too well, men who built their sense of self-worth on the backs of others, who couldn't stand to be reminded of their own inadequacies. He could see that Rick was a man on the edge, driven to this confrontation by his own insecurity. With a sigh, Tom took a step forward, placing himself directly in front of Rick, his voice low and measured. "I'm giving you one last chance, Rick. Walk away. Go home. This doesn't have to end badly for you." But Rick laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed down the empty street. "End badly? You think I'm scared of you?" He took another step closer, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't get it, do you? You're in my town, on my streets. I decide how this ends." Tom met his gaze, his expression unchanging. "Then you've made your choice." The finality in his tone sent a ripple of fear through Rick's men, but Rick was too blinded by his rage to notice. With a furious snarl, he lunged at Tom, his fist swinging wildly. Tom sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, his movements smooth and controlled. In a swift, fluid motion, he grabbed Rick's arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground with an effortless strength that left the other men gaping. Rick cried out in pain, his face pressed against the cold pavement, his pride shattered along with his bravado. Tom leaned down, his voice barely more than a whisper, but cold and unyielding. "You wanted this, Rick. Remember that." He released Rick, letting him collapse onto the ground, defeated and humiliated. The other men stood frozen, too afraid to intervene, their loyalty to Rick dissipating in the face of Tom's quiet strength. One by one, they backed away, unwilling to meet Tom's gaze, until only Rick remained lying broken and alone on the empty street. The humiliation Rick suffered in front of his patrons and his own men stung more than he'd anticipated. Returning to the bar, his mind raced with anger and a growing need for revenge, each thought darker and more bitter than the last. He clenched his fists as he entered, only to find his regulars watching him with looks that held more than a hint of amusement. Some even smirked, as if relishing the sight of their usual overlord laid low. Rick felt a rush of fury wash over him. These were his people, his bar, his town, and they dared to look down on him. He wasn't about to let this go, not without reasserting his control over his bar, and certainly not without making Tom and his daughter understand the price of crossing him. With a low growl, Rick slammed his fist onto the counter, the sound echoing through the nearly empty bar. "You think this is over?" he hissed, casting a withering glare over the men who had the nerve to look at him as if he were weak. "You think one old man is going to get the better of me in my own damn bar?" Hank, one of Rick's cronies who had been too drunk to join the earlier confrontation, looked up with bleary eyes, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Looked like he had you pinned pretty good there, Rick," he slurred, his voice mocking. "Maybe time to let it go, huh?" Rick's face twisted into a sneer as he grabbed Hank by the shirt collar, dragging him close. "You think this is a joke, Hank?" he growled, his voice laced with barely contained rage. "You think I'll just let that old man humiliate me in front of you all?" His eyes scanned the room, daring any of them to defy him. "If you don't want to find out what I do to traitors, then you're coming with me." One by one, the men exchanged nervous glances. They didn't like Rick much, but they respected him enough to know what he was capable of, and now, with his pride and reputation on the line, there was no telling what he'd do. Reluctantly, they each nodded, some looking away to hide their unease. They didn't necessarily agree with Rick, but their loyalty or fear was enough to compel them. They exited the bar, their footsteps heavy as they walked down the empty street under the cover of night, following Rick's orders like shadows bound to a grim purpose. Rick's anger fueled his every step, his eyes burning with an intense hatred. He was set on finding Tom and making him pay, making them both pay. He'd been waiting years to take back the respect he thought he deserved, and tonight he'd settle the score. Meanwhile, Tom and Mia walked at a steady pace, their backs to the main street, taking a path that cut through a darker, quieter section of town. Tom had always taught Mia to stay alert, to notice when something felt off, and tonight, despite the apparent stillness around them, he felt the prickling sensation of eyes watching them. He knew Rick's type men who couldn't stand to be challenged, especially by someone who had once been a part of their own community and had moved beyond it. He understood, too, that men like Rick didn't let go of grudges, particularly not when they felt slighted or threatened. As they walked, Tom caught a faint sound, the shuffle of multiple footsteps behind them. Mia felt it too. She glanced up at her father, her eyes filled with concern. "Dad, are we being followed?" Tom kept his expression neutral, his gaze forward. "Just stay calm," he murmured. "Let's see if they're brave enough to follow us all the way." Mia tightened her grip on her father's arm, her heartbeat quickening. The darkness around them seemed to thicken, and the silence was punctuated only by the occasional distant sound of the town's nightlife winding down. They continued walking, the shadows lengthening as they passed under dim street lamps, each one casting a faint, ghostly glow on the path ahead. Behind them, Rick and his crew of men closed in, their steps growing bolder, louder. They knew Tom could hear them. That was the point. Rick wanted to instill fear, to remind Tom of who held the real power here. Finally, Rick called out, his voice dripping with malice. "Hey, old man, think you can just walk away after what you did back there?" Tom stopped, pulling Mia gently to his side, positioning himself between her and the approaching group. He turned slowly, his expression calm but intense, his gaze fixed on Rick and his men. "Is that what you want, Rick? Another lesson?" The men behind Rick exchanged nervous glances, shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't what they had signed up for. They thought they'd be intimidating a lone man and his daughter, not confronting someone who had already bested their leader once that night. But Rick was too far gone, too consumed by his own rage and humiliation to back down. Rick sneered, taking a few aggressive steps forward, close enough now that Tom could see the gleam of anger in his eyes. "You think you're so tough?" he spat, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Just because you got the drop on me back there? You think that makes you better than us?" Tom held his ground, his gaze steady. "This isn't about being better, Rick," he replied, his voice calm, almost casual. "It's about knowing when you've already lost." Rick's face contorted with anger, his hands balling into fists. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he snarled, taking another step closer. "You're in my town, on my streets. I decide how this ends." Tom regarded him with a look of pity, then turned to the men standing behind Rick, his voice taking on a commanding tone. "You think this is going to end well for you? You're following a man who's too blinded by pride to see that he's already lost." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Leave now, and you won't regret it. Stay and I'll make sure you understand just how big a mistake you've made." The men hesitated, each one casting answers at the others. But Rick's pride wouldn't allow him to back down, and he couldn't tolerate seeing his own men waver. He threw a contemptuous look over his shoulder, his voice laced with venom. "Cowards, the lot of you," he spat. "Either you're with me, or you're against me." With his reputation on the line, Rick turned his full attention back to Tom, his sneer twisted into something darker, more dangerous. "You don't get to make demands here," he said, his tone a harsh whisper that carried a threat. "You've already crossed a line. Now I'm going to make sure you regret it." Tom sighed, almost disappointed. "Last chance, Rick. Walk away." But Rick only laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the empty street. "Walk away? I don't think so." He stepped forward, fists clenched, his stance tense and aggressive. Tom's expression shifted, his calm exterior replaced by a look of steely resolve. He took a step forward, placing himself between Rick and Mia, his movement slow, measured. "If that's how you want it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. In an instant, Rick lunged, his fists swinging wildly. But Tom was ready. He sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, delivering a swift, precise blow to Rick's side that sent him stumbling back. The other men froze, their confidence shattered by the ease with which Tom had dispatched their leader. Rick, still dazed, staggered to his feet, his face twisted in pain and humiliation. "You," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You think you're so tough? You think you can come into my town and make a fool of me?" Tom didn't respond. He simply stood there, his gaze unflinching, his stance unyielding. He looked past Rick, his eyes meeting those of the other men, each of them now visibly uncertain, their earlier bravado fading fast. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that none of them could deny. "Leave now, and you won't regret it." One by one, the men began to back away, their loyalty to Rick dissipating in the face of Tom's quiet strength. They had seen enough to know that they were no match for him, and they wanted no part in Rick's vendetta. As they turned and walked away, Rick was left alone, his pride shattered, his power over them broken. Breathing heavily, Rick glared at Tom, his face contorted with hatred and frustration. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice a trembling whisper. "You think you can just come here and—" But Tom cut him off, his voice calm but deadly serious. "It's over, Rick. You've already lost. The only question now is whether you're smart enough to know it." Rick's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing. He knew, deep down, that Tom was right. He had lost, and there was nothing he could do to change that. As Rick's men scattered into the shadows, the quiet street fell into an uneasy silence. Tom stood alone in front of Mia, watching as Rick struggled to his feet, face twisted with rage and humiliation. A cold determination flickered in Rick's eyes, a stubbornness that bordered on madness. Even with his allies abandoning him, he couldn't bear to accept defeat. He staggered forward, fists clenched, his breathing ragged, his eyes locked on Tom with a burning hatred. "You think you're better than me," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just come into my town and show me up in front of my people?" Tom's expression remained calm, but there was an edge to his voice, a restrained power that commanded respect. "Rick, this was over before it even began. You're just too blind to see it." Rick let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "No one comes here and humiliates me. No one." He took a step closer, raising a trembling hand and pointing it at Tom. "I've run this place for years, and what are you? Just some washed-up soldier looking for a fight." Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond to the provocation. His stance was relaxed, but Mia could see the readiness in his posture, the quiet intensity in his eyes. He was prepared for whatever Rutwick was planning, and his calmness only fueled Rick's anger further. Rick's voice dropped to a low, menacing growl. "You think you're tough, huh? Think you're a hero?" He took a final step forward, now close enough that Tom could feel the heat of his breath. "I'll show you what a real man looks like." Without warning, Rick lunged, his fist swinging in a wild arc. But Tom was ready. He moved with the precision and speed of a trained fighter, sidestepping Rick's punch and landing a swift, calculated blow to his side. Rick staggered, momentarily winded, but his anger pushed him forward again. He threw another punch, then another, each one wilder than the last, each one met with the same calm deflection from Tom. To the onlookers, it was clear that Tom wasn't just fighting, he was teaching Rick a lesson. Every move was measured, every strike deliberate, as if he were demonstrating just how outmatched Rick truly was. Each time Rick attacked, he found himself outmaneuvered, outclassed, his every move countered with a quiet efficiency that spoke to years of training and experience. Frustration mounted in Rick's eyes, and his swings became more desperate, more reckless. "Stand still, damn you," he spat, his voice hoarse with rage and exhaustion. But Tom didn't oblige. He continued to dodge, his movements smooth and unhurried, his gaze unwavering. Finally, after a particularly clumsy attempt from Rick, Tom seized the opening. He moved in close, grabbing Rick's arm and twisting it behind his back with a force that left him gasping in pain. Rick's knees buckled, and he let out a strangled cry, his face contorted with agony. Tom leaned in, his voice low and steady. "You brought this on yourself, Rick. All your anger, all your pride, it's what got you here." His grip tightened, and Rick's face twisted even further in pain. "You're no leader. You're a bully. And the only reason anyone followed you was because they were too scared to stand up to you." Rick struggled, but Tom's hold was unbreakable. The realization of his own weakness hit him harder than any physical blow could have. His mind raced, desperately trying to cling to the scraps of his authority, but it was slipping away, crumbling under the weight of Tom's quiet strength. "Let me go," Rick choked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He tried to sound defiant, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Tom released him, pushing him forward with enough force that Rick stumbled and fell to his knees. He looked up at Tom, his face a mixture of anger, shame, and something else, a flicker of realization, of understanding just how far he had fallen. Tom's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "This is your last chance, Rick. Walk away. Go home. Find a better way to live your life, because if you don't, you're going to end up exactly where you are now, alone, defeated, and broken." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His pride was too wounded, his spirit too shattered. He looked down, his shoulders slumping in a silent admission of defeat. The fight had left him, drained from him like water through a sieve. He was empty, hollow. The shell of the man he had tried so hard to convince himself he was. Mia stepped forward, her gaze steady as she looked at Rick, her voice calm but firm. "You need to understand something, Rick. You're not the only one who's lost tonight. Every time you lash out, every time you bully someone, you're taking something from yourself too. And soon, there won't be anything left." Rick glanced up at her, his eyes flickering with a mixture of shame and resentment. But he didn't argue. He couldn't. The silence hung heavy in the air as Rick finally climbed to his feet, his movements slow and weary. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his head bowed, his steps heavy with defeat. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly powerless, and the weight of that realization settled over him like a shroud. As Rick disappeared into the darkness, Tom turned to Mia, his face softening, the fierceness in his gaze replaced by a quiet pride. "You okay?" he asked gently. Mia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yeah, I'm okay." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." Tom gave her a reassuring smile, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. They stood together for a moment, the silence stretching between them, filled with an unspoken understanding. They had faced down a bully, a man who had spent his life trying to control others, and in doing so, they had reclaimed a piece of themselves. As they turned to walk back down the street, the night seemed a little less dark, the weight of the evening's events lifting slightly with each step. Tom knew that their journey wasn't over, that there would be more challenges to face, but he also knew that they had something stronger than fear or anger on their side. They had each other, and that was all they needed. The quiet of the night felt deeper as Tom and Mia walked homeward, side by side. The tension that had gripped them for hours was finally starting to dissipate, leaving a sense of quiet relief in its place. Tom's arm was draped protectively around Mia's shoulders, and though neither of them spoke, the silence between them was filled with unspoken words of gratitude, strength, and love. Behind them, the bar stood empty, its windows darkened. In the empty streets, whispers of what had happened that night would soon spread, growing and morphing into tales of the old soldier who had come back to town and left a lasting impression. Tom knew that he and Mia might be remembered in that town for some time, not as troublemakers, but as those who had dared to stand up against an authority built on intimidation and fear. As they reached the small inn where they were staying, Mia turned to her father, her expression thoughtful. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before, Dad," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You were so calm, even when things got really bad." Tom gave her a gentle smile, his eyes softening. "You don't always have to raise your voice to make a point, Mia. And sometimes, silence can be louder than any shout. Men like Rick feed off intimidation and anger. Take that away, and they're left with nothing." Mia nodded slowly, considering his words. It made me so angry. All of it. The way they looked at us, like we didn't belong, like they could just make us disappear if they wanted." Tom's expression turned somber, and he squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "Anger's natural, Mia. It's part of the fight. But if you let it control you, you give them exactly what they want. Remember, you're stronger when you control it, not the other way around." They entered the inn, its old-fashioned lights casting a warm, welcoming glow over the lobby. The few remaining patrons glanced at them as they walked in, eyes curious but respectful. Tom and Mia returned their glances with quiet nods before heading up the stairs to their room. As they reached the top of the stairs, Mia stopped and looked back down the hallway, as if searching for something. "Do you think Rick will leave us alone now?" she asked quietly, the vulnerability in her voice catching Tom's attention. Tom paused, his expression thoughtful. "I think he's learned his lesson, and even if he hasn't, we showed him that we're not people he can push around." He gave her a reassuring smile. "You held your ground tonight, Mia. That's not an easy thing to do." Mia gave a small, proud smile, her shoulders relaxing a little. "I guess I learned from the best." They shared a moment of quiet laughter, and for the first time that night, the weight of the evening's events truly began to lift. They had stood up against something dark, something insidious, and they had come out stronger. For Mia, the experience was a defining moment, a testament to the strength her father had instilled in her. The next morning dawned softly, casting a golden glow over the town's streets. By the time Tom and Mia had packed their bags and checked out of the inn, whispers about the events of the previous night had already started to spread. The townspeople they passed on the street regarded them with a mixture of respect and awe. Some nodded quietly, while others simply watched as they walked by, expressions unreadable. It was as if the whole town had shifted in response to what had happened. As they made their way to the train station, Mia noticed a few familiar faces from the bar watching them from afar, a mixture of respect and curiosity in their eyes. Even those who had once been indifferent or suspicious seemed to regard them differently now. Tom and Mia had proven something to the town, something that went beyond words or actions. They had shown that true strength lay not in intimidation, but in courage and restraint. Before boarding the train, Tom turned to Mia with a gentle smile. "You know, I didn't come back here expecting to fight anyone. I thought this was all in the past." He looked out over the town, his gaze distant. "But sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us, especially when there are lessons left to be taught." Mia nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I'm glad we came, though," she said quietly. "I feel like I understand you a little better now, and I understand myself better too." Tom put a comforting hand on her shoulder, his gaze warm. "Remember, Mia, you're stronger than you think, and you don't have to prove that strength to anyone but yourself." They boarded the train, finding seats by the window as it began to rumble to life. As they pulled away from the station, Mia looked out the window, watching the town recede into the distance. She felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of closure. The town might never change entirely, but she and her father had left their mark, a reminder that respect and dignity were not things to be taken lightly, and that those who stood up for themselves were not to be underestimated. As the train gathered speed, Tom leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes, his face relaxing into a rare expression of peace. He had returned to the town of his youth, faced down the shadows that lingered there, and shown his daughter the strength of her own resilience. For him, it was a victory that went beyond any confrontation, a victory of the spirit, of values and legacy. And for Mia, it was a moment that she would carry with her, a reminder of who she was and who she could be. In that quiet moment, father and daughter sat side by side, bound by their shared experience, moving forward with a newfound understanding of themselves and each other. The past was behind them, but the lessons they'd gained would carry them far into the future.